I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Hari Kunzru is the author of what, 6 novels now? Blue Ruin is
I think this is 7. This is my number 7.
Sorry. But I'm in love with this book. I'm in love with Blue Ruin. You do so many things in a very tight space with a very tight cast. And obviously we're staying spoiler-free in this conversation, but Hari, the men are not okay. The men in this book are not okay. They're just not okay.
And all in different ways.
Yeah, which is part of the fun. But we're in upstate New York. We're on an estate. It is locked down. And we're meeting Jay, who is a former artist, and he has just rolled up to deliver groceries. And there is his former lover, Alice, standing in the driveway. When did you start working on this book exactly?
I mean, I wanted to write a novel about artists, and I'd been tinkering with ideas for it for quite a long time, but it really only did come together with the pandemic and with the realization that there was something about lockdown that was very conducive to a particular sort of overheated domestic story. And so, yeah, I realized I wanted to put these very wealthy and messed up people in an isolated place upstate, and then have into their group come somebody who's so incredibly disruptive in that he just makes everybody have to assess their lives and to think about decisions they made a long time ago and to kind of confront all the stuff that they've swept under the carpet.
Jay is a fascinating guy. At one point, he's described as someone that folks would write conspiracy theories about on the internet. Which, when I hold that close to Red Pill and everything that happened in that novel, I feel like there's a little bit of overlap. But Jay is a very specific kind of guy. We meet him, not at a great point in his life, but he had success.
Yeah, I mean, as the novel opens, he's living out of his car. He's delivering groceries from door to door in this place upstate, and he's extremely sick as well. He has long COVID. He's in a bad physical state, and he's not as young as he was, and is being forced to kind of confront his mortality in a way that he's always avoided before. And one thing he certainly wasn't expecting was to arrive at a house and find somebody who he hasn't seen for 20 plus years and who ghosted him with effectively his best friend. So it takes everybody back to their early 20s and the things that they did then, and this milieu that they were in East London, this art scene around the turn of the millennium, which was a kind of grubby and fabulous sort of moment and place, which they all kind of spun out of in their different ways. And it's also, I guess, it's a book about male friendship as well. And, as you say, the men are not okay. And when the men have to talk to the other men, it's doubly problematic. But back in this time, a long time ago, there were 2 young men, both of whom wanted to be painters. And one of them carried on with that, and the other one fell away from painting into various kinds of less material, less consumable sort of art. He, became interested in performance and things like that. And then now, many years later, one is a successful gallery artist, albeit one with a lot of overheads and a lot of Me Too-ish baggage. And the other one hasn't been seen or heard from for decades. And so Jay's arrival back in the art world is also part of the plot of this story.
Part of the fun for me when I was reading Blue Ruin is the way art and commerce keep conflicting, right? Like, you and I are roughly the same age. And so we sort of came up at a time where, yeah, even if you were going to do the thing, you didn't want to sell out. Like, we are sort of very Gen X and that kind of thing. And it's not really realistic, obviously. If you're a writer, you would like to see the sales. And as a bookseller, I would like to sell the books. So, but there was that moment when we were young, especially in our early 20s, where it was like, so are we going to burn everything to the ground and make a new world? And we kind of did and kind of didn't.
I mean, I think that phrase selling out is so interesting in that it's more or less disappeared from the vocabulary, but it was such a sort of central cultural decision circa 1988. and it was, the idea of putting your creative work into commercial circuits of exchange was something that was considered to be, it was a black mark for certain sorts of art, in that you would be forced to compromise formally or in your sound if you're a musician. But it does presuppose that there were other circuits. I mean, there was a proper independent distribution of record labels, small presses,
Yep.
performance spaces. You could subsist, perhaps not in a kind of lavish way, but you could certainly subsist in this alternative artistic economy, and that is one thing that's gone now. And so Jay was very much wrapped up in those kind of questions, and his friend Rob, who's become the painter, was very happy with making a big bunch of money from selling fabulous large paintings to wealthy collectors. That conflict was there ages ago, and now has come to a kind of full fruition. And one is an absolute outsider, and the other is an absolute insider. And so they're both kind of just by their existence, these two men are kind of criticisms of each other. I mean, they're kind of, two of them can't be right at the same time.
But you're also talking about authenticity, right? Who gets to be an artist? What does it mean? Do you get to call yourself an artist if you're not making art? But what if you're making art and no one knows? And these are all kind of fun, for me at least as the reader, they're fun questions to sort of puzzle through in this locked room setting. I mean, essentially, it's that Agatha Christie device, right? Like you put them all into a pressure cooker. No one can leave. You can walk around the property, but that's not the same thing. And you've also thrown in Rob's dealer, Marshall, who there's a lot happening.
Yeah, he's someone who the pandemic has not treated him very well psychologically, and his consumption of conspiracy media and his general feelings that this is the herald of some larger apocalypse have led him into a state of paranoia and complete alienation from his much younger girlfriend, who's there as well, who is a young black emerging artist who nobody seems to see as an artist at all. And her various silences and the times when she's kind of essentially outside this very small circle are also part of the texture of this very sort of messed up social micro world.
It's still fun to read, though. It's still, I mean, do we technically call this a satire? I don't know
what I call it. I call it a romance because one of the sort of secret structures of the book is actually Midsummer Night's Dream, in that that's a story where you go from the real world of the city into the enchanted wood, and strange things happen. You turn into animals, or fall in love with the fairy queen, and this is a place out of time that has but it's a place money has bought and isolated and made to be out of time and to be away from all the kind of to be away from the virus apart from anything else. And so Jay steps into the enchanted wood and things change for him. I mean, I was thinking also, like a lot of writers, about the Decameron and about people hiding out from the plague in Florence in the Middle Ages and telling each other stories. So I definitely wanted to have this enclosed world and to make a romantic story. It's an unlikely story. It's a story of people, it's a story propelled by a coincidence. And so I mean, if I say it's a romantic comedy, that makes it maybe sound less dark than it is in places, but it's certainly got elements of that.
I think we can call it darkly comic. I mean, I was laughing so hard as I went through this. And there are a couple of things that you do that obviously we're not going to talk about specifics, right? Like, we're just not going to do that here.
Thank you.
But there might have been some yelling when I realized around page 191 what you had done. And there was yelling because it's such a satisfying moment. I mean, I'm getting all of the big intellectual questions about art and who makes it and who gets to tell story, all of the stuff that I love in a novel. And then I also get plot. It's structured in a wild way.
I know all the reasons why one would want to break plot in certain ways and to kind of subvert plot, and I've often done that in the past. But there was something about this that that somehow needed a very straightforwardly satisfying arc. It had to close in a certain way, and it had to propel itself along in a certain way. And it gave me pleasure to write, to just try and kind of polish this sort of smooth, the tracks on which this story was running. I mean, that's a terrible mixed metaphor, polishing the tracks, but you know what I mean.
I mean, it's clear to me that you had a lot of fun writing this book. There's a sense of play. I mean, there are a couple of moments with different characters where I'm like, yep, glad I'm not stuck in a room with you. Glad I can put the book down. A couple of things Marshall does. Rob has a moment where I'm like, oh, dude, get over yourself. But I mean, the fact that I'm talking about fictional characters, again, like, you know, they were just down the hall, delights me to no end. Because you also have this line, and I'm stealing it from Red Pill, actually, where you talk about how plot is the way you take all of these big ideas and you form reality into what you need. I'm paraphrasing you poorly, but this idea that we live in a random world, right? And like, it doesn't make sense if you just let it be random on the page, that you actually have to give it form and, oh, right, borders.
Sure. I mean, there's that famous Delillo line, I think, from Mao too, about novelists and terrorists being in a zero-sum game, about kind of telling stories. But there's something. In fact, no, that's the wrong question. It's not even the quote I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of something in Libra where he says he plays a lot with, you know, it's about conspiracy and it's about the Kennedy assassination, and he talks about plot in the sense of a conspiracy and plot in the sense of making a narrative, and always both those things are to do with the kind of artificial reduction of complexity. The world is enormous and misshapen and random and strange, and things happen in ways we don't understand, and it's very hard to identify heroes and villains should you be so inclined. And so conspiracy is comforting because it kind of puts 12 people in a room, and if you just bust down the door and arrested them all, then badness would end in the world. And a novelist's plotting is the same, and so I'm very comfortable with the artificiality of it in a certain way. With the right kind of project like this is a project which is an artificially shaped. As I say, I just think of it as a romance, and so I enjoyed making this sort of tightly plotted story.
It's also, when you hold it on the timeline of your work with White Tears, Red Pill, now we've got Blue Ruin, and yes, thank you for the red, white, and blue, because I'm still laughing over that too. But I mean, you've got music and White Tears driving the whole thing.
Writing in Red Pill.
Yeah, I mean, writing in Red Pill, but also Red Pill sort of morphs very quickly into more a conversation about society and how we are failing each other, and that the words aren't enough, which I thought was an interesting way to approach things as a writer. Like, dude, what? We are kind of fixing things through literature, Hari. We really are. Not always, but we try. And now here we are with visual art. And it feels like to me, you've been sort of rolling these ideas around
for a decade or so. I've been
right.
This question of can art make change, and the various fights you have to fight in order to try and make art that feels authentic, no matter whether you're painting or you're writing or you're making music or whatever. And how all these questions, these artistic questions, and these questions about artistic identity get wrapped up in bigger things. I mean, the colors, the flag kind of colors in these books are, they have meaning in the sense that they're, say State of the Nation seems like a kind of a bit pat, but there's always a kind of political horizon to these three books about, I occasionally see kind of grumbling that novelists aren't attempting to take on the present moment and the textures of the present moment. And I think that's very much my project in these books, that there are structures of feeling that are very particular to now. The pandemic, the moment of the Trump election, and the paranoia that was around that, the kind of the sort of painful shift of the Overton window away from a kind of complacent post-war liberalism to whatever it is now. and the kind of and in White Tears, I suppose the disavowed history of the United States, and all these things, seem to me urgent questions to be talking about in the culture in general, and they're useful questions for a novelist, or let's say the novel is a useful venue for thinking about them, because it can bring all sorts of different things to bear. You can talk in many different ways in a novel, and you can connect things together that would be slightly harder to do if you were, writing a nonfiction or making other kinds of work. So I think the novel's quite a good vehicle for this kind of how are we all thinking and feeling now, sort of question.
But also capturing the passage of time, right? Like nothing does that quite the way a novel does. I mean, not even film and television. And certainly the interiority is much harder to show in a different kind of medium, right? Like we have this sort of luxury of freedom of movement on the page, like whether you're coming to it as a reader or you're coming to it as a writer, there's an entire world that sort of comes together in that intimacy, right? Whereas if you're watching something on the screen, it's like, I'm not dismissing that as art. Please don't misunderstand me. But
the example I always sort of talk to students about is that the character in the movie has done something morally questionable, and it's had terrible consequences. So they burst into the washroom and vomit into the sink. And that's the only way to externalize what's a very complicated interior state. In the same way, if they're sad, they sit by the window and the raindrops come down on the window. I mean, you have to make, these are conventions in film, but you don't have to do that in a novel, because you can burrow straight inside and see those things happening.
And sometimes it's very funny to see other people's bad decisions, especially, I mean, you're flashing back between people in their 50s and people in their 20s, and that's a big gap. That's a really big gap in experience. Also things just like financial security as well. I mean, in theory, we get a little more stable as we go, and that doesn't necessarily happen for everyone the way they would have expected in this book. And the idea that money is supposed to buy you your freedom, and yet it kind of doesn't in this case.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's, one, Jay has nothing materially, but has lived a kind of fierce and independent life, which we gradually find out about during the book. Rob has always had a lot of toys, and he's been able to be excessive, and yet is the work that he's making with this supposed freedom actually the freest and best work he could make. So that's a question, and he feels hemmed in by his own grandeur in a certain way.
I'm trying to talk about structure in a way that doesn't give anything up. The ending of this book is so deeply satisfying on a bunch of different levels. Everyone gets their arc. Let's put it that. Everyone gets their arc in this book. But when you're sitting down to start a novel like Blue Ruin, and I'm sort of separating it out a little bit because just it feels different on the page than White Tears and Red Pill to a certain extent. Did you know where you were going? Or did you just think, I have this moment and I have these people and I'm just going to turn up the heat and see what happens?
No, I knew roughly where I needed it to go, and I knew some sort of central things about Jay's life that made everything else kind of unfold in a certain way. But often the process of writing in the beginning, that's very, very loose, and roughly where you're trying to kind of aim for, and you're trying to drive the rickety vehicle towards it, and then gradually that becomes tighter. And I can think of a couple of sort of big structural things that happened. The book divides quite neatly up into two halves, and that didn't quite emerge so clearly until later in the process. So yeah, and I was enjoying trying to kind of make it as sleek a sort of thing as I could, because it seemed right for this story.
How much of the writing though was rewriting in this case? Because these sentences are really like this book. There's a flow to this novel and these characters in the setup that is so organic to this story that I'm kind of like, all right, this is not the kind of thing that comes out in a single draft. This is not
No, I
6 weeks.
officially I write, I think, 3 drafts, but the first of those drafts has this kind of circling that's gone on, whereas especially the first, I don't know, the first quarter of, I mean, this is for everything I've written. I think I rewrite that again and again and again and again, because there's a particular note I'm trying to hit, a particular tone I'm trying to capture, and I can't go on until I understand the voice I'm talking in. I suppose that's the best way of thinking about it. And once I've found that voice, then I can tell the rest of the story. And very often that comes much more easily. There's a sort of sad foothills period of the first draft where it's muddy and the going is hard and you keep slipping backwards. And then, hopefully you get to the dizzying heights of the end.
But I mean, you've been in the States now for almost 20 years. I mean, it's been a minute, and I sort of feel like you're much more a New Yorker now than you are, say, a Brit, which is, the generic term that New Yorkers use for folks who come from the UK.
I mean, it's 15 rather than 20, but that's still that's a significant period of time. And all my big stuff has happened to me here. I became a father in this city. I became a husband in this city. And, I'm certainly not the same person I was when the person who left the UK. And I think I've managed because I kind of dropped into the conversation like part of the way through. There were certain things that were not obvious to me that appeared obvious to everybody else, and that I could kind of ask, well, why do you all talk like that? Or why do you have that frame of reference? It's kind of useful to come in with your own slightly skewed version of things. But I mean, New York is definitely home now. I mean, it's the culture that I mean, of course, using the word "from" in New York is like a ridiculous thing to do, but it's the culture I'm in. I was a teenager who looked at movies with a certain sort of New York setting where smart people argued about books and art, and then sat in a cafe. I mean, I was like, yeah, that's what I want, and I didn't actually necessarily realize that I was organizing everything to acquire that.
Do you feel like you understand the States better, though, after these 3 books? Because, I mean, if you look at the earlier body of your work, right, we've got sort of India and the UK and bouncing around in time, among other things. There was Transmissions, Gods with No Men, and then Mojave. And I'm missing some. What am I missing?
The Impressionist in 20s India, and then Transmission about a sort of Indian migrant in California. So that had America in it, but very much a kind of outsiders.
Yeah.
America. It wasn't an American book in a straightforward way. I wrote about 70s terrorists in London, and then I moved here, and the first book I wrote in the US was Gods Without Men, all set out in the Mojave Desert and that was, I wanted to kind of, I wanted to write a book about God, actually. It's a book about spirituality and the desert and a certain sort of weird transcendentalism that turns up in the kind of backyard of California in that kind of high desert landscape. And then, I started this sequence of 3 books, which were very deliberately about grappling with the place I had come to live in. I mean, and I needed to write something about race and history, and I needed to understand. I mean, that was a project to kind of try and think through that and to use this long history of recorded music to do that. I mean, I've always been very interested in music. I spend far too much time kind of thinking about music and coveting music of various kinds. But that was a way to kind of get into that particular history. And then paranoia and conspiracy theory is something that I've been interested in forever, and suddenly seemed to sort of, I don't know, flower into the mainstream in a way that I felt it had been in abeyance a little more before recent times. And then something, I don't know, Facebook radicalized everybody's uncle. And, suddenly things that had been the province of the fringe were now at the absolute center of the political conversation. And that move fascinated me. It was like, for me, it was like a kind of slightly weird bit of my head I'd had forever, that kind of, where I went on these sites and thought about these things. Suddenly that was everywhere. It was like I'd kind of accidentally, like, opened a trapdoor and had gone into the world.
But it's also kind of an explosive adolescence. I mean, in a lot of ways, if you look at the memes themselves, like it's like everyone's inner 15-year-old came flying out.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly there was a weight given to the brains of adolescent thinking, where it was like, oh, we used to make fun of this. We used to just be like, yeah, you can go hang out and like go for a walk or something and just chill out for a second because that's just wild. And now suddenly, it's just, I mean, people know what the internet is. I don't have to know
I guess one of the terrifying things about growing older is that you suddenly realize there are no grown-ups. That's the kind of, it's almost like the primary fiction is that there never were any grown-ups. And, at this point, I should surely be one if such a thing was possible. And yet here we all are, like, running stuff, and they've given us the car keys, and
it's wild. It's absolutely wild when you look around and you're like, hi, okay, here we go. But at the same time, I mean, when I look at the through line, right? So authenticity, obviously, and the quest for authenticity and what that means, and whether it's an authentic story or the presentation of a story, right? Like you've talked about how fiction itself is sort of the presentation of experience, of character, all of this kind of thing. And, there are times where that's a really useful device to have. And then there are times where we get too caught up in the surfaces, right? And one of the things I appreciate about what you do, is particularly in this set of novels, is that you never lose sight of sort of the bigger philosophical questions. And yet we still get stuff. We get a story. We get voices that we can't shake. I mean, also, I'm thinking about Anton in Red Pill, and I'm like, oh, I'm glad your guy met him. I'm glad I get to leave him behind on the page. But he is a vital piece of the story. And we've all met dudes like that. I don't, not necessarily a television person, but like everyone has met an Anton. They just may not know it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I came up as a real aficionado of what used to be called systems novels. I mean, the kind of work I was interested in as a young writer were the kind of novels that enmeshed characters into large structures, social structures, political, metaphysical, whatever it would be. And I suppose as I've gone on, I have become more and more interested in a kind of style that's maybe less flashy than that, or is maybe less sort of maximalist than those sort of canonical 70s systems novels. So, and I am interested in speaking simply where possible. I think that's and I am interested in the ways that as individuals we're kind of formed by these things, and yet we are quirky and particular, and we're very much ourselves. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the style that has kind of emerged for me that works I'm interested in all these kind of big and abstract things, but I quite like to talk about them maybe slightly obliquely and through the doings of my characters, rather than, having a sudden kind of essayistic digression about, I don't know, pig breeding or V2 rockets or whatever it would be.
I mean, there's a moment, and this made me laugh too. The narrator in Red Pill is told by his therapist to actually try to explain his experience and not just do it using film and books and visual art. And I just laughed. I was like, well, isn't that...
And he's outraged by that. He finds that a real imposition.
Completely. Yeah. But it just made me laugh because I was like, well, isn't that why we connect with art and literature and music? I mean, isn't that... And when I saw the jacket on Red Pill too, it's a very famous painting. And if you've seen it, anyone will recognize it. But it's been used on the cover for Frankenstein, a bunch of different editions.
Well, we chose it. I mean, I approached the designer saying I wanted him to do something with that precisely because it's a cliche. It's The Traveller on the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. And so he's standing there. I mean, I think I probably first saw it on the front cover of a Penguin Nietzsche at one point. Oh, yeah. And, and it's like, it's on the cover of every sort of textbook about romanticism. So it's, he's a kind of sovereign self. He's a he's a man on top of the world who's, his senses are filled with the clouds that he can see. He's a romantic individual, and then what we've done with this is kind of occluded him almost completely with this sort of strange, abstract, geometrical design. So if you know the painting, he's behind there, but what you're actually getting is this kind of, I suppose, softly psychedelic kind of op art visual piece of interference, and that interested the designer John Gore, and it interested me a lot as a solution to talking about exactly this. About it's a continual preoccupation of mine is the degree to which we're sold this story that we're individuals, and that our choices are these sort of sacred acts of self-definition. I shall have strawberry rather than chocolate, therefore I am. And yet we're kind of constrained in all sorts of ways, and we're much less secure, and we're much less kind of continuous, and we've got holes in us. We've got strange dropouts, and we're things are kind of much weirder than that picture actually. That picture of the sovereign individual, actually implies. And so I think that's all important stuff for a novelist right now. We don't believe in the same self that 19th century novelists thought of as character. We're in a much more kind of odd and haunted kind of moment.
And that individualism doesn't work for the characters in Blue Ruin. Individualism is not good for any of them.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is a sort of a slightly disavowed thing about how we think about artists and writers is that as people who have a certificate of complete selfhood. Like if you are doing something creative, the great buzzword of our times, then you are sort of generating something out of yourself and putting it in the world. And that's like, that's the only thing that is considered a sort of valid proof of being a person, and this idea that artists are these specially selfie selves, is interesting to me. I mean, often in knowing a few of these types, driven by lack and sort of gaping sense of inadequacy, rather than this kind of wonderful, cornucopia of stuff that you're somehow generating and putting out into the world. So, I mean, there's a kind of ideological aspect of how art is used to authorize a particular sort of model of selfhood in our society at the moment. And so writing about artists is necessarily to end up writing about what, how we feel about ourselves as persons right now.
But also when I look at the intersection of Jay and Rob and Marshall, and the intersection of their ambition, and the intersection of sort of the directions they've all gone in, and their POVs, and how they are just so wildly mismatched in so many ways. And yet they all sort of think they're on the same page, because in some way they're all connected to art.
Yeah, and I'm also interested in who gives themselves permission to take that status, and who ends up kind of thinking of themselves as a helper, or it's a very gendered thing there, and that's part of what happens in the book as well. I mean, Alice, who is Rob's wife and Jay's former girlfriend, has had her own ambitions, and she's by far the most intellectual of that of the group. She's a person who reads hard theory books and thinks about things like that, and yet she's had to kind of, well, she says she's had to put her ambitions aside in order to manage Rob's outsized career and the various, as she says at one point, that I clean up his messes,
right?
And his messes are ugly and humiliating for her, and so she has a kind of bitterness that comes out of not being able to kind of just unselfconsciously put herself first and unselfconsciously make herself the center of a creative story about being a genius or whatever it would be. And yet, although certainly Rob the painter and Jay, the sort of outsider former artist, is concerned, they have made themselves the center of their story in a particular kind of guy way that is utterly unselfconscious, and they're much more they're much closer to each other in that than they could possibly imagine. And so, I mean, hopefully the reader sees them from outside as well. And the kind of everybody's perspective in this book is supposed to relativize everybody else's. Right. Yeah. So we get everybody's story about what they think they're doing. And then it's like that meme. It's like, what my mum thinks I do, what I think I do, and what I'm actually doing.
Have you started the next thing?
I have. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm in a pretty untalkable about thing,
yeah.
But I'm very interested in, let's say I can say that I'm very interested in ideas about positive thinking and about how you can make the world, or people believe you can make the world through having a particular attitude towards it, or by thinking, by making your thoughts real. And I feel there's a real instability about the notion of reality that's around at the moment, and I'm trying to pick away at that.
That's a novel I will read. I'll sit quietly over here while you do. All right, so before we risk spoilers, because we're getting really close to places where we could dip into the story, and I really, really don't want to do that. I got so much pleasure out of meeting these characters and going through their arcs. And when I say everyone gets an arc, I'm really not kidding. And also the setting's a little wild. There's some sculpture on the, like, I really, really am going to just say thank you, Hari Kunzru. Blue Ruin is out now. If you haven't read White Tears and you haven't read Red Pill, you don't have to have read them before you read Blue Ruin.
Absolutely
but
not.
It's really satisfying if you can read them sort of close together.
Yeah, you can read them in any order. They're three separate stories, but they just... Totally. They're supposed to vibrate together, let's say.
They definitely do. And I'll tell you, I read them backwards. I read them each when they came out, obviously. Well, Blue Ruin's about to come out, but I've read them in the order in which they were made available to me in Galley. But this time I went Blue Ruin, Red Pill, White Tears. So, yeah, you can read them in any order. It's totally satisfying. But they're fun, and they're funny, and they're a little weird. And I say that with love. But yeah, Blue Ruin, it's out now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.